Hello guys, welcome back to John's workshop, and no surprises, it's part 3 of the engraving machine. So I gave all of that away last week, so this hopefully will be the final episode. I'm going to try my hardest to get this over the line. So during this week's episode we've got the final piece to go back on, which is the head unit largely, or the final big sub-assembly to go back on. So that needs some strip down, some cleaning, some repair work here and there, some understanding. So there's some bits and bobs on there that I don't know what they do, so I'm going to have to do a bit of figuring out as I take it apart. So a bit of that to go through, and some electrical stuff, electrical safety type stuff on some of the wiring. We'll be doing some of that, and then reassembly. And then the final thing I need to do is the copy plates that sit right on the bottom of the machine that hold the brass copy or the lettering sets. I need to clean those up and get those refitted, and then we should be in a position to plug this thing in and give it a bit of a test and see how it goes. So I will be bringing you back very shortly as we crack on with that head unit disassembly and cleanup. Okay guys, so this is the head unit. Largely all of the casting really is just a bit of cleanup. There's nothing to do really with that. There's some nuts that have got some rust on. There's the bore where it goes on the columns, going to need a bit of cleaning. Clamping bars, again, clamping levers need some work. There's the rack and pinion shaft in there. I've not really examined that. I don't think that one's bent. It's probably the only one on the machine that hasn't been. So we've got a bit of cleanup to do with that. We've got a spring which I'm presuming fits over that little screw at the bottom there. That's the only place I can imagine it goes. And then there's some kind of spring tensioning device in here. Don't really know what that does yet, so I've got a bit of work to do to try and figure that out. Got the machine lamp that's got a broken bulb in it. Again, don't know what I'm doing with that yet, whether I'm gonna just get a new bulb and clean this all up, put some fresh wiring in it or whatever, or check wiring that's in it, or whether we're going to convert this to an LED or something. I don't know yet. We'll figure that out as we get into it. We've got the motor unit itself at the top, which, as I've shown in a previous episode, is all kind of wibbly wobbly, so we need to kind of understand that. We've got this kind of quick release button thing on the top that I don't know what that does, but that's all corroded up. We've got this adjustment that's probably about as bent as it possibly could be, and well, it still works, so we need to have a look at that, straighten all that out and clean all that up. So yeah, a few bits to do. And then there's the spindle unit itself, which feels pretty good. I don't think there's any need to be stripping that down and putting new bearings in or anything. It feels quite nice. There's no appreciable end float that I can feel in there. There's no rumbling, so we're just not going to mess with that, other than giving it a bit of a general clean up, get the rust off it. So I will bring you back shortly when I've disassembled this into its component parts and we're attacking the first bits. So there we go, 10 minutes in with some tools, and we've got this pretty much back as far as we're going to go with it. So what news? Well, largely fairly good. So this bent adjuster on the top has got an incredibly fine thread on it. I'm glad that's gone the way it has, because the thread itself, well, certainly this portion of the thread itself, is perfectly straight. The bend is in this top bit, so we may be able to do something with that without affecting this fine thread down here. So this all unscrewed quite well, so we need to get this apart. Even the the thread in the top that holds the hand wheel thing on, even that's bent. So this has obviously been dropped at some point and landed on this. And apart from that, quite a bit of rust. This is right at the top of the machine, so it's taken the worst of the bad weather that this thing's obviously been sat in, so quite some rust on it, but we'll hopefully clean up okay. Apart from that, everything else looks pretty good. The pinion shaft on this one is not bent, so that just needs a bit of cleanup. That's all good. This unit, which I'm presuming is kind of a quick release of the spindle itself, height, is seized solid, so I need to do a bit of work with that and see if we can get that unseized. The central portion of this obviously moves in and out based on this moving, but you can see how rusty that is. That's just caked in rust solid, so quite some work to do with that. Apart from that, everything else is just clean up. Cabling and wiring, you can see the state of it. There's a couple of bits in it that are through the insulation. The insulation looks old, it's cracking if I put it under strain, so that's clearly not good, so that needs to come out. That's the wire that supplies the motor. The motor itself has come out okay, but has got evidence of it's been taped on at some point. I don't know why it's been taped on, but it's been taped on, and there's a diameter down the bottom here that's gripped into place with the grub screws. In the top of the spindle here there's 3 grub screws that go through and bite on that diameter. It was all loose and wibbly wobbly. Maybe somebody decided that taping it on was better than just tightening the grub screws up, or maybe there's a genuine reason why they did that. So I'm going to have to split this motor to sort the wiring out anyway, so it will give us a chance to have a look under the lid and see what's going on inside there, even though it will just baffle the hell out of me because I don't understand electrics, as most of you already know, so that'll be interesting. So yeah, and the machine light, again, you know, if this wire is in that state, I can't imagine this wire is much better for the light, and it's also been in this metal snake bending probably backwards and forwards, so who knows what state that bit of cable is inside there. So rather than have a shocking time at some point in the future, I think we'll have that to bits and see if we can put some new cable into there, so that at least I know it's good, being as this is all metal. Even the shade is metal. So, but apart from that, it'll clean up okay. And that is about it for this head unit. Obviously we're going to treat the spindle, we're going to go for the spindle separately. That's just clean up, as I said earlier. The only other piece of this that I've taken off, on this arm at the side here, there was a thread in there and a nut, and onto that screws the long handle that you use to lift the head up and down between letters. This really took some getting out, and when you look at it, hopefully you'll be able to see why. I hope the camera will show it. It's bent like a banana. So again, this has probably been dropped and bent, all of that handle. So we'll have a new piece of, this is M10 studding, we'll put a new piece of M10 studding in there to replace this bit. We'll Loctite it in. This original bit was Loctited in, that's probably why it took some getting out, but we've got that out now. So we'll replace that bit of studding, and that should straighten the handle up when we put the handle back on. So a lot of yabber in there. I'm going to crack on now with some of the cleanup, and when I get to any interesting bits I will bring you back and show you what we're up to. Alright guys, I thought we'd start with the easy bit. You know when you see films and you see guys just like lost in the middle of nowhere and they haven't got a clue where, that's me. That's where I am right now looking at this. This is not my thing, as most of you know. So we've took the lid off, fairly straightforward, just an aluminium lid with a switch in it. There's lots of black on the wires, which I'm presuming has come from the carbon brushes. And I'm going to start talking about stuff now like I know what I'm talking about, but I really don't, as most of you know. But the armature itself, which I believe is this bit, looks in pretty good condition. It doesn't look scored up or anything like that. I've had a look at this badge plate, best I can read it, 220 volts, I think it's 0.42 amps and 45 watts and 10,000 RPM is what that says on it. I understand the 10,000 RPM bit, and so what we're going to do is just, I really don't know what we're going to do, we're just going to clean it up and pretend that I know what I'm talking about. So I've popped one of the carbon brushes out, and you know, I'm no expert, but I would say that's got some life left in it. So that would suggest this probably hasn't done a huge amount of work over its years. It certainly doesn't look like the carbon brushes I remember seeing my dad take out of an electric drill back in the 1970s that were almost down to the spring. So I'm going to leave them well enough alone. It ran okay, albeit it sounded a bit funny. So largely I'm not going to do anything with this, guys, because it's out of my comfort zone, other than I'm obviously going to need to, when I put a new wire in, I'm going to need to connect my live, neutral and earth back to the respective connections, and basically just give this a, I don't know, a wipe over with a dry rag and clean some of the carbon dust off it, largely without disturbing anything, and just see if we can tidy it up. And then I'm going to put it back together and forget all about the fact that I took it apart. So I will be doing some of that. Might bring you back just before we pop it back together and let you see what a good job I've made of it. Alright guys, we've got the top back on, most of it back together now, cleaned up, and you can see this. Look at it unlocked. This is so easy moving now, it's actually under its own weight, almost dropping down the rack, so that all works nice. Just lock that back up, so make sure it doesn't drop. So we've got everything almost back on. We've got the spindle cartridge to go back in, so I just thought I'd talk about that. So here's the spindle itself. So we've had to take some of the black off here, chemical black, which doesn't matter because it's come to a good home now and it will stay good, but I had to do that to remove the rust that was on it. We've got the rust off the spindle itself, off the spindle sort of shaft. It all feels, you know, it all feels nice. When we get to the front end of this, the collet, I had a right game getting that out, because whoever's had this before, so this collet is it's a special collet. It's probably an Elma collet, you know, it's specific to Elma machines. I would think it's not an ER collet, but it's very similar to an ER collet, and you can see by how that's sat in there, it works just like an ER collet. The collet's got a groove in it, and the groove sits in this front part of the nut, just like an ER collet does in a groove. And whoever had last done this up didn't realise that was the case, and had just crushed the collet into the taper, you know, with the front of the nut without it being sat in the groove properly. So there was no way of actually getting the collet out. Obviously, while the collet's clipped into the nut, when you take the nut off, the collet comes with it. You know, you've got an easy way of extracting it. But yeah, it was well wedged in, and it looked like it had been wedged in there for some years. I had to get some heat on it, not a lot, but a bit of gentle heat just to free it, and then it was all rusted into the taper. So we've got all of that cleaned up. We've got the collet back in. I've only got the one collet, unfortunately, and Peter, if you're watching, I will be measuring that up and creating a drawing of it at some point, because I don't think I'm going to be able to get any more of these collets, and I would probably like to make myself some. So I will be getting onto that in the next foreseeable future. So I'll drop you a copy of that drawing. So that's Peter, who's got the same machine as me and would like the dimensions of the collet. So what we're going to do with that spindle now is just drop that back into the machine. So it just sits in there like that. There we go, that's got the spindle in. Now I still don't know on these bearings. At times I do think they sound rough, but they don't feel rough. But they'll do for now, and worst case scenario, if I have to pop the two bearings out and put new bearings in, then that's what we'll do. So I've figured out what all these bits and pieces on the top do, so I'll just bring you in a bit closer and we'll just talk around that. So there's various bits and pieces here that I showed earlier on. So we've fixed our bent adjustment, so that's all nice and straight now, and it runs lovely in the thread, so that's nice. We've fixed our seized up quick release stop on the spindle, and that's what that's for, and I'll show you that working in a minute. And we've cleaned up all of this spring. This is a spring pressure actuator for keeping this thing out of cut. I thought it was to keep it in cut to start with, but it's actually for keeping it out of cut. So I'll spin you around the other side of the machine and show you what I mean by that. And this is for actually winding on your depth of cut. So this is how you decide how deep your engraving needs to be once you've touched off on the surface of the job. So I'll just bring you around the other side and show you what I've done around there. So on this side we've got a new piece of M10 stainless studding back in here, and this is all now nice and straight, whereas before, because the studding was bent, this handle was all bent. Obviously we've cleaned all of the handle up as well, so that's all good. So how this thing actually works, and I'll just see if I can show this on the camera, should be able to. So as I said, this is your depth of cut applied with this wheel here, and then you actually, I just need to remember myself how this works now. There we go, that's it. So yeah, this is, you can see as I'm backing this wheel off, I'm getting more and more movement. As I wind the wheel in, I get less and less movement. So it's almost the opposite of what you'd expect. So you kind of undo it to put more depth of cut on, if that makes sense. So it kind of works anti-clockwise to go deeper, but then the numbering is the right way. So the numbering on the wheel, as you'd expect, is the right way. So basically this is, I nearly said push to torque. It's actually push to cut. So you when you're cutting, and I'll just zoom out a little bit further to show the whole thing. So hopefully you can see all of this working now. So we've got our table surface moving, we've got our stylus down here adjustable. So you drop your stylus into your letter, wherever that letter is. You then push down on this lever, so it's a two-handed operation to engage the cutter into the workpiece. You then obviously follow your letter wherever that is, then you let go, head lifts up under spring pressure, which is adjusted by the spring tension on here. You then move to your next letter. Once you're in the letter, you then push to cut, do your next letter, let go, spindle lifts up, move to the next one, push to cut, and so on all the way across your letters. So I've now figured out what all of the bits of this machine do, apart from this card and holder piece that I mentioned earlier. Sorry, slight addendum. I didn't explain what this bit was for. So as I'm doing my push to torque, when I think this is a safety device, when you want to be safe, you drop that across there, and then as I'm now pushing that lever, there's no more torquing. So this is your safety catch, for want of a better word, just to stop that going into the workpiece. So there's a tiny bit of adjustment I need to do on the nut on the bottom of this shaft, because really there should be zero movement when I touch that. So there's probably about 20-30 thou movement there, so just got to adjust that, but largely that's what that stops for. Alright guys, I'm back onto the motor. So I've just given it a clean up, nothing more than that. Been really gentle with it, cleaned the wires up so that I can kind of inspect them. They're discoloured a little bit. I'm presuming these used to be red, they're in a pinky colour now, but everything looks to be reasonably okay, except on this wire, and I really don't think the camera will pick it up, but just where my finger end is there, let's see if we can zoom in. Well, if you can see that, but the insulation is missing, so we've got bare wires there. and what's happened with that is at some point that's got crushed up into this gap in here, and it's been touching the armature, so I can quite well imagine that interfered with the motor. So I don't, this is wired into the coils down here. I could cut it slightly below where that's happened and try and put a join on, but I've inspected the copper wires and the copper wires are all intact, so I don't think there's any copper wire damage. At that point it's literally just the insulation. So what we're going to do is, I've got some heat shrink tubing and we're going to drop some of that over to about there, so that's well past where the damage is, and we're just going to heat shrink that on and cover that bare wire up. So that's the first thing, and then as I start to do the wiring, I'm going to try and find some way of fastening this all up so that that can never happen again. Alright guys, we've done the best I can as a non-electrical person with this. So we've cleaned it all up best we can, just got rid of the dust in a very non-aggressive way, and I've rerouted the wiring as best I can to keep it away from the moving parts where obviously it had been rubbing before because the wires had just been mashed in any old how. So I'll just zoom you in. So what we've done is, I've got my new cable coming in here. I've used the only thing that I've got to hand which fits in this available space, which is these type of sort of spade end type connectors, male and female. So we've connected our new wire with spade end connectors. We've shrink wrapped all of those connections, and what I also did was tinned all of the wire ends before I crimped them into the spade end. So quite happy that that's a very, well, I think anyway, that's a very secure connection. And as I said, you can see I've rerouted the wires around the bottom, got the switch at the front here ready to fit into the housing in the right position, got a new earth wire that you can't see around the back, earth into the frame in the same position the old one was, and I'm now just going to fight with the lid, getting the lid back on. You don't want to watch that because you won't see much because my hands are just going to be in the way the whole time. So I'll get the lid put back on, get the switch fitted back in the lid at the front. Incidentally, how I said earlier, there was a spare hole. I think I might have already covered this. That's for the light, the cable for the light. So that's all back in, and we've tidied up where that goes in. So rather than having two separate plugs now, we've just got the one, and it's all coming through this single power source, so much as it was originally designed to be. So I'm going to crack on, see if we can get this lid fitted. The only other thing I've done, these holes that hold the lid in place, what was in there was some self-tapping screws, which meant sticking out the backside were the points of self-tapping screws, which may be why the wires had been moved higher up, I don't know. But I've drilled and tapped these out M4. I'm going to cut some M4 cap heads off so that they're just sitting flush with the inside without a pointed end on them, so there's nothing sharp that's going to rub against the wires with any vibration of that nature. So as I say, I keep saying it, I'm not an electrician, but I think that's probably about the best I could do with this setup as it is, certainly with the gear I've got and the knowledge and skills that I've got. So hoping that's going to be much better than it was before. I'll bring you back in a short while. So I've cleaned up one of the plates for the letter copy to go in, and I've cleaned up a couple of the clamps, and we've just put a letter I in there, or I think it's a letter I as opposed to a number 1. This is brass copy. I've got quite a lot of it from the Taylor Hobson engraver. It's not designed for this machine, So I have got a slight issue in the fact that the copy is a little bit of a tiny bit of a sloppy fit in here, which I can fix by using getting some kind of shim or something to go in here. So that's fairly simple to fix. But for now I'm just got the letter I in. We've got it clamped up tight, which, well, there is a bit of movement in there. I'll try and get it a bit tighter. So what I'm going to do, I've got a clock on the side of the table up here. You can just see the stand. I'm just going to move you up, and all I want to check is, as I'm moving the letter in a straight line, the stylus in a straight line through this letter I, like this, I want to check that with all the work that I've done on the bearings and all of this mechanism, that I'm actually getting a straight line movement of the table up above. So we're just going to move up to the clock and show you that. So here's my clock on the side of the table. For the zero fanatics, we'll get it somewhere near zero. And I'm now just going to move the stylus through the letters, through that letter I, and I've got about, the clock jumps about a little bit. This is a cheap import clock, but I've got about, best I can measure that, top to bottom, 10, 20 microns maybe, something like that. These are in 0.01 of a millimetre graduations. So front to back I've got about 20 microns, which is a thou. And I've got this set on the highest setting, so the highest magnification setting, if you want to call it that. So largely that would create some really big lettering at that. And obviously the smaller I go on that scaling factor, the smaller that 20 micron error is going to get. I think a lot of this jumping about is you can see it there as I move the stylus side to side. That's that brass copy moving between the two stops that I've just put on. So that's what a lot of that is. If I keep it pressed up to one side, I've got about, as I said, 20 microns top to bottom. So fairly happy with that. So the next thing to do is put some lettering in and give it a try and see how we get on. Now I'm hampered slightly in the fact that I've only got the one engraving bit that came with this machine, and both ends of that are blunt, so I'm not going to get a very good copy. So I need to order myself some more engraving bits, but that's not a problem. And also with a D bit like this, there's no way you can hand grind them. You need to grind them on a D bit grinder. They're not a hand grindable, or certainly I've never seen one being hand ground, and when you look at the geometry on it, almost impossible to do by hand. So we will do what we can with what we've got just to test the machine out, and then obviously over the course of time I'll get some new D bits and we'll give it a proper test. So we'll just get some letter input into the stencil, the copy plate at the bottom, and set something up on the table and see what happens. So we're all set, I think. I just need to set my depth of cut and we'll see what happens. Well, there we go guys, that's got a bit of engraving done. So yeah, blunt tool as I said, I need to have a close-up look at that, but largely it works. And even though I am going to try incredibly hard not to bring politics of any description into my channel, I think enough said. Well, there we go guys, that's really, it's not quite the end of the Engraving sort of refurb. I've still got some bits and bobs to do, but in order to not let this drag on too long, you know, that's 3 episodes on the trot, and I guess you guys will be getting bored fairly soon of watching me scrubbing bits of dirty stuff down and reassembling it. So I'm reasonably happy with that. I can't really test it properly yet because, as I said, I need some decent D bits, so I need to get myself some of those. I've got my suspicions about the motor. It's still making some funny noises. It changes its RPM now and again, which tells me that it's not running as it should be. So that's either the bearings in the motor shaft itself or the bearings in the spindle. I'm inclined to think it's the bearings in the motor shaft based on the noise it makes, but so there's a bit of kind of bit more work to do on that. I've got the second copy plate to clean up to go back on the bottom, so I've got 2 copy plates, and I've also got a vice unit that's on my other engraving machine that came with this one when I bought them both, that I want to clean all of that up as well and get that fixed onto the table of this machine, so I've got something that can clamp square stock, round stock, and it's got some axis movement adjustment, you know, adjustment on it as well. So a bit more work to do with that. I've got a bit more general tightening, tweaking, clocking, just to make sure everything's absolutely right, and I've got to do something with my, as I showed earlier, the sloppy copy, for want of a better word, that I've got in the sort of unit at the bottom. Now that copy is really expensive to buy, those brass copy sets, and I've got a lot of copy there. There's probably a good 2 or 3 sets, so I don't want to get rid of that and have to get something else. So it's far cheaper and quicker and easier to adapt the copy plates at the bottom to accept that copy. So that's probably needs a bit of thought on how we're going to do that, but you know, at a basic level I could just cut some shims of the right thickness and just slide those in and slide the copy in. That's, yeah, a little bit fiddly each time I want to use it, so I might look to do something a little bit more permanent than that, but yeah, it's a fairly easy problem to fix over time. I've got a new light bulb to put in because the light's not working because the light bulb was broken, but that's all wired in now properly. So yeah, I'm really pleased there. If I think back to how that came with all bent handles, oh yeah, that's another thing. I've got to do some machining to, you know, fix the handles on the X and Y axis that are both broken, so a little bit of machining on that. We might chuck that in another episode because it is something a bit different, so we'll do that at some point in the future. But all in all, really pleased with that. You know, the machine itself is absolutely fantastic. The quality, as I've said in previous episodes, the build quality is, you know, it's really, really good. It just needs a bit more sort of real fine tweaking and a bit of time for me to get used to it. You know, it's the first time I've used it, first time I've really done any engraving, so I've got to go on the learning curve of, you know, what sort of type of tools to use, when, and that kind of thing. I need to do a bit more practicing, but overall, incredibly happy with it. And so we'll call that a wrap, I think, at that, and we will close this episode out. So thank you all very much for watching, thank you for subscribing, thank you to the new subscribers that have come along, and we will catch you all very soon on another video when we'll be making something else.